A wounded horse refused to move, and when the farmer followed her, what he found in that ravine changed his life forever. After the storm, the valley lay quiet beneath the mist. A farmer led his injured horse home, unaware that her strange behavior would soon uncover a secret buried for decades. When the horse stopped at the edge of a ravine and refused to move, he thought it was stubbornness, until he heard the faint cry that would pull him back into life, love, and the echoes of the past. The storm had passed, but its memory still lingered across the Cascade foothills. The fields were soaked, the air heavy with the smell of wet pine and earth. Jacob Harris walked slowly along the muddy path, his boots sinking deep with every step. He held the reins of his white horse, Echo, whose left hind leg dragged slightly, leaving a faint line in the dark soil. The sky above was a bruised gray, sunlight fighting to break through the torn clouds. Jacob didn't speak. He hadn't spoken much to anyone in years. Since his wife, Claire, died of cancer 3 summers ago, silence had become his closest companion. He lived and worked alone on a small horse farm at the edge of town, a few acres of grass, a wooden barn that creaked in the wind, and a house filled with ghosts that smelled faintly of cedar and old photographs. Echo stumbled, and Jacob stopped, glancing down. "Come on, girl," he muttered, tugging the reins. His voice was rough, unused. The horse's breath rose in clouds, her eyes dark and wet under the fading light. She made a soft sound, part pain, part refusal. In the distance, thunder murmured its last complaint, rolling over the mountains like a tired sigh. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke from the town below, people burning damp wood to keep the night chill away. Jacob didn't look toward the town. He didn't look anywhere except at the ground before him. Behind him, at the edge of the barn, a small figure stood watching. Emily, his 11-year-old daughter. She clutched a sketchbook to her chest, its cover smudged with charcoal and pencil dust. On the top page, half finished, was a drawing of Echo and her mother standing beside her father under the same hill they now walked across. But the mother's face was never quite right. Emily had erased it too many times. She whispered softly, though no one could hear. "I just want Dad to smile again, like before." Jacob led Echo into the barn, the wood creaking under the weight of memory. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and rainwater dripping through the roof. He tied the horse near the corner stall and fetched a bucket of water. His hands were rough, lined with small scars, the kind you collect from years of work and grief. He examined Echo's leg, a shallow cut, red around the edges but not deep. "You'll be fine," he said quietly, though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself. A framed photo on the wall caught his eye, Claire holding Echo's reins, sunlight bouncing off her auburn hair. The frame had gathered dust, and a strand of cobweb hung from the corner. Jacob reached out as if to wipe it, but stopped halfway. Instead, he turned back to the horse and muttered, "You were her favorite." Outside, rain began again, soft and steady. Emily's voice came faintly through the sound. "Dad, dinner's getting cold." "Go inside," he replied, not looking up. She hesitated. "Did you feed Echo?" "I said go inside." Her small footsteps faded away, swallowed by the rain. For a long moment, Jacob just stood there, staring at the floorboards, listening to the rhythm of droplets hitting the roof, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something he didn't want to face. Then Echo shifted. Her ears twitched toward the trees beyond the pasture, head lifting sharply. Jacob noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer. The horse snorted, muscles tensing. Lightning flashed far away, revealing the dark line of the forest still slick from the storm. The silence that followed felt different, thick, alert, almost breathing. Jacob listened. Nothing but rain and wind. He patted Echo's neck. "It's just the weather, girl." But Echo didn't calm. She kept staring toward the same direction, the ravine beyond the ridge, where the land had collapsed during the flood. Jacob sighed, closing the barn door. The sound of the latch clicking echoed like a sigh through the empty space. He didn't notice that Echo's eyes followed him, filled not with fear, but a strange, urgent knowing, as if something in that ravine was calling her name. Later that night, as Jacob sat alone by the fire, the old clock ticking on the wall, he thought he heard a distant sound outside. A low, trembling whinny carried through the rain. He frowned, listening. For a second he thought it was just the wind, playing tricks again. But then, it came once more, softer this time, almost like a whisper from the dark. "Jacob." He rose from the chair, heart thudding. Echo's stall was just beyond the window, but when he looked out, she wasn't there. The door to the barn was open, swaying slightly in the storm's leftover wind. Jacob grabbed his coat, his breath fogging the glass. "Damn it, Echo," he muttered. "Not tonight." Outside, the rain had turned to mist, curling low around the ground like smoke. His flashlight beam cut through the fog, searching. Hoofprints led away from the barn, toward the ridge, toward that same ravine. And for the first time in years, Jacob felt something stir inside him. Not anger, not sorrow. Something else. Something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. He followed. The morning came slow and heavy, like a memory that refused to fade. Mist hung low across the valley, and the fields shimmered with dew. Jacob followed the trail of hoofprints that cut through the wet grass, the flashlight still in his hand from the night before. The prints stopped near the edge of the ravine, the same place the floodwaters had torn open weeks ago. Echo stood there, her white coat dimmed by mud and rain, her head turned toward the forest below. "Echo," Jacob called softly, his voice echoing faintly across the hollow. The horse flicked her ears, but didn't turn. Her front leg trembled slightly, and when Jacob tried to move closer, she took a hesitant step back, not away from him, but away from the edge, as if guarding something unseen. "Come on, girl," he muttered, tugging the reins gently. She refused. He pulled harder this time, frustration rising in his chest. "We've got work to do." Echo braced her weight, the muscles in her neck tightening. Her eyes never left that dark gap in the earth. Jacob sighed, looking down into the ravine. Mist swirled between the rocks like smoke from a hidden fire. He couldn't see much beyond the broken trees and scattered branches. The air was heavy, still carrying the damp scent of the storm. "Fine," he muttered. "Have it your way." He tugged harder on the reins, but Echo let out a deep, uneasy breath, half groan, half plea. Jacob froze. Something in the sound hit a place inside him he didn't want to visit. It was the same tone Claire had used when she was in pain, refusing help, wanting to stand on her own even as she grew weaker. He let go of the reins. "All right," he said softly. "All right, girl. We'll rest here a minute." Echo lowered her head, snorting softly. Her breath mingled with the fog. Jacob knelt beside her, brushing the mud from her injured leg. The cut had opened again, thin blood mixing with rainwater. He frowned. "You're making it worse," he said quietly, but there was no anger this time. Only worry. He reached into his coat for a cloth, then stopped. A faint sound drifted up from below, a noise so small it could have been the wind or a trick of the mind. But it came again. A thin, muffled cry. Jacob straightened slowly, heart pounding. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice bouncing back from the walls of the ravine. No answer. Just that same faint, broken sound, the kind of sound a child might make through tears. He looked at Echo. Her ears were pointed forward now, eyes locked on the same spot below. She pawed the ground once, a sharp thud against the wet earth. "You hear it too," Jacob whispered. He stepped closer to the edge. The slope was steep, the soil soft from the rain. Somewhere beneath the fallen branches, the sound came again, weak, desperate. "Hold on!" he yelled. His voice trembled more than he expected. He turned to Echo. "Stay here, girl. Don't move." Jacob slid down the muddy bank, gripping roots and rocks for balance. His hand slipped once, scraping against a sharp stone, but he barely noticed. The cry came again, louder this time. And then he saw it, a small, trembling figure half buried under a tangle of debris. It was a boy, no older than 8, his hair matted with mud, his face pale and streaked with dirt. One arm was pinned beneath a branch, his clothes soaked through. His eyes fluttered open as Jacob knelt beside him. "It's all right, kid," Jacob said quickly, voice low but firm. "You're gonna be okay." The boy whimpered, trying to move. Jacob lifted the branch with a grunt, muscles burning, then slid his arms under the boy's shoulders. "Got you," he whispered, as if saying it could make it true. Above them, Echo whinnied, loud, piercing, echoing off the canyon walls. It didn't sound like fear. It sounded like urgency. Jacob looked up toward her silhouette framed against the gray sky. "We're coming," he muttered. "We're coming." The climb was brutal. Mud sucked at his boots, and his hands shook with exhaustion. Halfway up, he nearly lost his footing, pressing the boy closer to his chest to shield him from the fall. The boy's breath was shallow, but steady. "Stay with me," Jacob said between breaths. "You're safe now. You hear me?" When he finally reached the top, Echo was waiting. Still in the same spot, head low, nostrils flaring. Jacob laid the boy gently on the grass, wrapping his coat around him. He turned to the horse, meeting her eyes for the first time in days. "You knew," he whispered. Echo exhaled slowly, her whole body relaxing, as if a weight had lifted from her. Jacob glanced at the boy again, unsure of what to do next. His phone was dead. The storm had cut the signal last night. The road was 2 miles away. He looked down at Echo's injured leg, then back at the unconscious child. He made a choice. "Girl," he said quietly, kneeling beside her, "I need you one more time." Echo lowered her head, pressing her muzzle gently against his shoulder, the same gesture she used to make when Claire would whisper to her in the barn. Jacob took it as a yes. He lifted the boy again, placing him carefully across the saddle. Echo stood still, patient. Jacob steadied him, then took the reins. "Let's get him home." As they began the slow walk back toward the farm, the fog thinned, revealing a slice of sunlight breaking through the clouds. It spilled across the field, warm and gold, touching everything it reached, the man, the horse, and the boy who had been found because one animal refused to move. Jacob glanced at the sky, whispering more to himself than to anyone else. Guess you were right again, Claire. Echo's ears flicked at the sound of her name, and for a brief, impossible moment, Jacob thought he heard her voice too, soft, distant, carried on the wind. Keep going. The wind had stilled, but the world felt restless. Clouds drifted low across the Cascade foothills, dragging long shadows over the valley. Jacob walked beside Echo, the boy wrapped in his coat and tied securely to the saddle. The horse limped slightly, but never hesitated. Her steady rhythm, the only sound besides Jacob's breath. The faint smell of wet pine and smoke filled the air, a reminder that the storm had only just loosened its grip on the land. Jacob's mind was a tangle of thoughts. Who was this child? How long had he been trapped down there? The questions churned through him as he led the horse along the narrow dirt road back toward the farm. Occasionally, he glanced up at Echo, at the way her ears twitched with every sound. "You saved him," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "You really did." Echo flicked her tail, her breath fogging the cool morning air. There was something almost human in her calmness, something Jacob couldn't explain. It wasn't the first time she'd surprised him. Claire used to say the mare could feel things most people ignored, the shifts in weather, the mood of the people around her, even fear before it showed. Jacob used to laugh at that. But not today. When they reached the farmhouse, the morning light had begun to thin the fog, turning the fields to gold. Emily ran from the porch, her hair tangled from sleep, her eyes widening as she saw the boy draped across Echo's back. "Dad, what happened? Who is that?" Jacob raised a hand. "Get some blankets, Em, and the first aid kit." His voice was firm, steady, the tone she hadn't heard in years, the voice of someone who knew what to do. She obeyed without question, her bare feet splashing through puddles as she ran inside. He lifted the boy down, careful not to wake him. The child stirred, whispering something Jacob couldn't make out. His lips were pale, his face streaked with dirt and tears. Jacob carried him into the barn, warmer than the house, still smelling of hay, and the faint sweetness of the animals. He laid the boy on a pile of dry blankets as Emily returned, her small hands clutching the medical box. "His arm might be broken," Jacob said quietly, brushing mud from the boy's cheek. "He's lucky to be alive." Emily knelt beside him, her eyes full of worry. "What's his name?" "I don't know," Jacob admitted. "Couldn't ask." They worked in silence. Emily handed her father the bandages, and for the first time in a long while, Jacob didn't have to tell her twice what to do. He was surprised by her calmness, by how much she resembled her mother in moments like this. When the boy finally opened his eyes, they were blue, bright, uncertain, and full of fear. "You're safe," Jacob said softly. "You're at my farm. What's your name, son?" The boy hesitated, blinking against the light. "Noah," he whispered. Emily smiled gently. "Hi, Noah. I'm Emily. You're going to be okay." Noah tried to sit up, wincing in pain. Jacob steadied him. "Don't move too much. We'll get you to the sheriff as soon as you can stand." The flood," Noah murmured, his voice trembling. "I was walking home. Then the ground just—" He stopped, tears pooling in his eyes. Jacob put a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to explain now. You're safe. That's all that matters." Outside, Echo whinnied softly, pacing near the open barn doors. Her hooves struck the ground in a restless rhythm, her head turning toward the ridge again. Emily noticed first. "Dad, she's looking that way again." Jacob frowned. "What is it now, girl?" Echo didn't move closer, just stared toward the mountains, ears pointed and still. Her tail flicked once. The tension in her body was unmistakable, not fear, but alertness, as if something unfinished remained out there. Jacob stepped outside, following her gaze. The forest beyond the ridge glistened under the light, peaceful, almost too peaceful. He exhaled, the memory of the ravine still burning behind his eyes. "You already did enough," he said quietly, almost like a prayer. "Rest." Echo lowered her head, but her eyes never left that direction. By noon, the sheriff's truck rattled down the dirt road, tires kicking up a spray of mud. Sheriff Collins, tall and broad-shouldered with a weathered face, climbed out. "Heard you found a kid." Jacob nodded. "Down the ravine near the old flood line. Could have died there." The sheriff crouched beside Noah, his voice softening. "You're a lucky boy. Folks been looking for you since yesterday morning." He glanced at Jacob. "How'd you find him?" Jacob hesitated, glancing at Echo outside the barn. "She wouldn't move, kept staring that way. I followed." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "That horse of yours?" Jacob nodded. "Yeah." Collins gave a slow smile. "Well, maybe she deserves a medal." Jacob didn't smile back, but something loosened inside him, a tightness he hadn't realized he'd carried. "She's just doing what she does," he said quietly. After they left, Emily stood beside her father, watching the truck disappear down the road. "Dad," she said softly, "Mom always said Echo could feel things we couldn't." Jacob looked down at her. "Yeah, she said that." Emily tilted her head. "Do you think Mom would have followed her too?" He didn't answer. Instead, he watched the horizon, the same horizon Claire used to paint when they first moved here, before the sickness, before the silence. The light shifted through the clouds, a pale gold brushing over the barn. Jacob whispered, barely audible. "Yeah, she would have." Echo huffed, her breath curling into the cool air. The sun broke through fully now, scattering light across the valley, and for the first time in a long while, Jacob felt something like peace, fragile, trembling, but real. Inside the barn, Noah stirred again. "Mr. Harris?" His voice was weak but clearer now. "There was something else down there. I saw it before I blacked out. A letter. I dropped it." Jacob turned, his brow furrowing. "A letter?" The boy nodded slowly. "It was in an old envelope. I thought it was trash, but it had someone's name on it." Jacob exchanged a glance with Emily. The echo of the wind hummed faintly through the barn, soft, distant, and haunting. "Don't worry about that now," Jacob said gently. "Rest. We'll find it later." But even as he spoke, a strange unease rippled through him, like the world had whispered something he wasn't ready to hear yet. Outside, Echo lifted her head once more and stared toward the ravine, her mane glowing gold in the afternoon sun. The faint cry that had led them there was gone. But something else had begun to call. The next morning came with the stillness that follows heavy rain. Mist clung to the treetops, and the valley was wrapped in silver light. Jacob woke early, long before Emily stirred. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind. Echo's strange refusal, the boy trapped beneath the branches, that letter Noah had mentioned. It all felt too purposeful, as if the land itself had wanted him to find the child. He poured black coffee into a chipped mug, staring out the window toward the ridge. Echo was already outside, standing motionless near the fence line. Her white coat glowed faintly through the mist, her gaze fixed once again on the direction of the ravine. Jacob sighed, rubbing his face with both hands. You just can't let it go, can you? When he stepped outside, the air was cold enough to sting his lungs. He approached her slowly, his boots squelching in the wet earth. We're not going back there, he said, patting her neck. You did what you were supposed to do. But Echo only flicked an ear, shifting her weight impatiently. Inside the barn, Noah was awake, propped up against a pile of hay. Emily sat beside him, handing him a steaming bowl of oatmeal. You're strong for a little guy, she said with a grin. Noah gave a shy smile in return. My mom says I eat like a bear. Jacob entered quietly, his presence filling the space. How's the arm? It hurts, Noah admitted, but not as much as yesterday. Jacob nodded. The sheriff will stop by again today. He'll get you home. Noah looked down at his hands. My mom must be worried. His voice trembled on the last word, and Emily reached out to squeeze his fingers. Jacob turned away, busying himself with the tack on the wall, though he wasn't really working. He could hear Echo shifting outside, restless, scraping her hoof against the ground. Something about her unease gnawed at him. It wasn't just instinct, it felt intentional. By mid-morning, Sheriff Collins arrived. He checked Noah's arm, exchanged a few words with Jacob, then said, You're lucky, son. Could have gone bad fast out there. We'll get you home to your folks today. Wait, Noah interrupted. The letter. Did you find it? Collins frowned. Letter? Jacob looked at the sheriff, then at the boy. You sure you didn't just imagine? Getcha. Noah shook his head. No, sir. It was real. It was in an old envelope. The paper was yellow, and it said, To my son, on the front. The barn fell quiet. The sound of Echo's hooves outside broke the silence like a heartbeat. Collins scratched his chin. Might have been washed down from somewhere. Flood carried all kinds of junk through those ravines. You want me to take a look? Jacob hesitated. A part of him wanted to forget it, to leave the strange, haunting details buried under mud and rain. But another part, the quieter part that still remembered Claire's gentle curiosity, told him not to. Yeah, he said finally. We'll check it. I'll go with you. Emily stepped forward. I want to come too. Jacob started to refuse, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She had her mother's stubbornness, the same quiet strength. Fine, he said, but you stay close. The three of them rode out after noon, the sheriff's truck leading while Jacob and Emily followed on Echo. The horse limped only slightly now, determined, her breath fogging in the cool air. The forest around them was eerily calm. No bird song, no rustling leaves, only the slow creak of branches drying in the pale sun. When they reached the ravine, Jacob's stomach tightened. The place looked smaller now, but somehow heavier, like it still held the echo of what had happened. The smell of damp soil hung thick in the air. Echo stopped at the same spot she had before, planting her hooves firmly. Jacob dismounted, leaving Emily in the saddle. He crouched near the edge, peering down into the shadows. Collins joined him, flashlight in hand. You sure this is where it was? Jacob nodded. Down there, between those rocks. The sheriff descended first, steadying himself on roots and slick stones. Jacob followed. The ground was still soft, mud sucking at their boots. Then Collins stopped, his beam catching on something half buried near a cluster of ferns. There, he said. Jacob bent down, brushing away dirt and leaves. It was an envelope, water-stained but intact, the paper yellowed with age. The words, "To my son," were barely legible across the front. His hand trembled as he picked it up. "Looks old," Collins murmured. "Decades, maybe." Jacob nodded, unable to speak. Something about the neat, slanted handwriting felt familiar, though he couldn't place it. He turned the envelope over, feeling its fragile weight. "We'll dry it first," he said quietly. "Then open it." Back at the barn, Emily and Noah waited anxiously as Jacob laid the letter by the stove. The air smelled faintly of smoke and rain. Hours passed before the paper was dry enough to touch. With slow, deliberate care, Jacob unfolded it. The ink had faded, but not vanished. The first line read, "If you ever find this, know that I loved you more than my silence ever showed." The words struck Jacob like a blow. His throat tightened. He read further, though the sentences broke apart in places where the water had blurred the ink. "I wasn't a good man. I worked too much. I kept my love quiet because I thought you already knew." Jacob's vision blurred. He blinked hard, the edges of the room melting into light and shadow. Emily watched him, her small hands trembling. "Dad, what is it?" He shook his head, folding the letter shut. "It's just someone's old words," he said softly, but his voice betrayed him. Noah looked from Jacob to the letter. "It sounds like my dad," he whispered. Jacob forced a faint smile. "Maybe it was meant for someone like you." Outside, Echo whinnied, her voice rising clear and long into the evening air. It wasn't a sound of fear or pain. It was something else, something that made every person in the barn look up. The sound lingered, stretching through the quiet hills. Emily stepped toward the door, watching the last light of day fade over the ridge. "It's like she's trying to tell us something," she said. Jacob didn't answer. He just stood there, holding the letter against his chest, as if afraid the wind might take it, or bring back something he wasn't ready to face. Behind him, the stove crackled softly, and for a moment, the smell of burning wood reminded him of Claire's perfume. Faint, comforting, gone too soon. He closed his eyes, and in the hush that followed, he thought he heard her voice again. A whisper wrapped in Echo's call, carried by the wind. "Listen." The night fell slowly over the Cascade foothills, smothering the last of the golden light. Inside the barn, the lamplight wavered against the wooden walls, painting shadows that moved like ghosts. Jacob sat at the small workbench, the letter lying before him. Its edges were curled, its ink faded, but the words pulsed with something alive, something that had waited years to be heard. He couldn't stop rereading that first line. "If you ever find this, know that I loved you more than my silence ever showed." The handwriting was elegant, almost careful, like a man who wrote rarely but meant every word. Jacob's rough hands trembled as he traced the ink with his thumb. He wasn't sure why this letter struck him so hard. It wasn't addressed to him, yet somehow it felt written for him. Behind him, Emily's small footsteps broke the stillness. She came carrying 2 mugs of cocoa, her oversized sweater brushing against the floor. "You've been sitting here for hours, Dad." "I know. Did you find out who wrote it?" He shook his head. "No name, just the words." Emily leaned closer, studying the fragile paper. Her eyes softened. "It's sad, isn't it? Like somebody wanted to say sorry but never got the chance." Jacob nodded but didn't answer. His throat was too tight. Outside, Echo let out a soft huff, shifting her weight in the stall. The sound drew Jacob's eyes for a moment. "She's been quiet tonight," Emily whispered, "like she's waiting for something." Jacob smiled faintly. Maybe she's tired of saving people. But he knew that wasn't it. There was an unease hanging in the air, not danger, but the kind of silence that comes before a truth reveals itself. He felt it pressing on his chest. When Emily turned to go, Jacob reached out without thinking and touched her wrist. His hand was rough, but the gesture was gentle. He said quietly, "You did good yesterday. You stayed calm. Your mother would have been proud." Emily blinked, taken aback. Compliments from him were rare, fragile things. "Thanks, Dad," she murmured. Then, after a pause, "Do you miss her every day?" He looked down at his hands, the calluses catching the light. "Every morning," he said softly. "Every night." Emily nodded, biting her lip to keep from crying. "Me too." Jacob managed a small smile, the kind that cracked his face open for the first time in months. "You should sleep," he said. "You've had enough excitement for 1 week." When she left, the barn felt larger, emptier. The letter lay between his elbows, whispering memories he couldn't name. He thought of all the things he'd never said to Claire, how he'd buried his grief under chores, how he'd shut Emily out because silence felt safer than breaking again. The letter's last line caught his eye. "If you ever find this, forgive me for being the kind of father who loved quietly." Jacob stared at the words until they blurred. His chest ached, but in that ache there was recognition. He whispered to the paper, "I know exactly what you mean." A sudden sound outside snapped him from his thoughts, a sharp, clear whinny. Echo. Jacob stood and stepped into the cold night. The sky was full of stars, clean and endless after the rain. Echo was standing near the fence, her head lifted high, ears pointed toward the road. Jacob frowned. "What is it now?" From the distance, a pair of headlights appeared, winding slowly up the muddy track. It was Sheriff Collins's truck, its beams cutting through the mist. Jacob walked to meet him, his boots crunching against the gravel. The sheriff climbed out, holding his hat against the wind. "Evening, Jacob. Sorry to bother you again." "No trouble," Jacob said. "The boy's asleep." "Good," Collins replied. "His parents are on their way. Drove all night from the next county over." Jacob nodded. "He'll be glad." Collins looked at him for a long moment, then at the folded letter Jacob still held. "That the thing you found?" "Yeah. You mind if I take it? Might help track who it belonged to." Jacob hesitated, thumb brushing the paper's edge. A strange reluctance washed over him, as though giving it up meant losing something he hadn't finished learning from. Finally, he handed it over. "Be careful with it," he said quietly. The sheriff tipped his hat. "Always am, when the truck drove off. Jacob returned to the fence where Echo stood. The moonlight gleamed across her mane. "You happy now?" he muttered. She blinked, then nudged his shoulder gently. It made him chuckle despite himself. "You think you've got this all figured out, don't you?" He turned toward the house, ready to rest for the first time in days. But before he stepped inside, Emily's voice drifted from her window. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "You smiled," she said softly. "It's been a long time since you did that." Jacob looked up at her, and for a moment the weight of the past 3 years lifted just enough for him to breathe. "Maybe I finally had a reason to," he replied. She smiled back, small but true, then closed her window against the chill. Jacob stood there for a while longer, looking at the stars. They shimmered like the reflection of something long forgotten, but never lost. Behind him, Echo pawed the ground and gave one soft, low whinny, almost like a lullaby. Inside the barn, the empty table where the letter had rested caught the lamplight. The faint imprint of moisture on the wood looked almost like the shape of a hand, small, delicate, like someone reaching out to say it's not over yet. Jacob noticed it as he closed the door, and for the first time, he didn't feel alone. Dawn came with a thin mist rolling low over the pastures. The grass shimmered silver under the weak sunlight, and a cold stillness clung to the land. Jacob awoke to the faint sound of hooves outside, steady and patient. Echo stood by the fence again, her breath clouding the morning air, her ears pricked toward the mountains as though listening to something distant. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, pulling on his jacket. "You're at it again," he murmured, his voice rough from sleep. The horse lifted her head and stared back at him, motionless, expectant. It wasn't the usual restlessness. It felt like insistence, a silent demand. Behind him, Emily appeared, rubbing her eyes. "She's been like that since sunrise," she said quietly. "She hasn't eaten either." Jacob frowned. "Still thinking about that ravine, huh?" Emily shrugged. "Maybe there's something else down there. Maybe she knows." He almost laughed, but couldn't. Something about her certainty reminded him of Claire, that calm intuition that never needed proof. "Fine," he sighed. "We'll check one last time. Then maybe she'll rest." By the time they saddled up, the sun had begun to pierce the fog, painting thin ribbons of gold across the field. The air smelled of pine sap and wet soil. As they rode, Emily's small hands gripped the saddle horn, her sketchbook strapped across her shoulder. "Do you think the letter belonged to someone from town?" she asked. Jacob squinted toward the horizon. "Hard to say. Sheriff Collins thinks it washed down from the ridge after the flood." "But you don't believe that," she said. He hesitated. "No, I don't." The road to the ravine was quiet, except for the creak of leather and the distant rush of water. Birds were only just beginning to return after the storm. When they reached the edge, Echo stopped at the same spot as before, lowering her head toward the earth. Jacob dismounted, scanning the rocks below. "Stay back, Em," he warned. "I will," she said, but her eyes followed his every movement. Jacob climbed down the slope slowly, the ground still soft beneath his boots. The ravine smelled of moss and rain and the faint sweetness of decay. At the bottom, the sunlight filtered through the broken canopy above, scattering golden fragments across the mud. He looked where they had found Noah, but this time something else caught his attention. A glint of metal near a cluster of wet stones. He crouched down. There, half buried, was another envelope, sealed inside a small tin box rusted around the edges. The metal was corroded but intact enough to protect what was inside. Jacob pried it open with a rock, and inside, he found a letter folded neatly, the paper yellowed and stiff but untouched by water. His breath caught. "Dad?" Emily's voice floated down. "Did you find something?" Jacob stared at the box in his hands. "Yeah," he called back. "I think so." He climbed up carefully, his heart pounding with a strange mix of dread and curiosity. When he reached the top, Emily leaned forward eagerly. Is it another letter? He nodded. Looks that way. Can we read it? Jacob hesitated, running his thumb across the fold. The handwriting on the outside was faint, but familiar, the same careful slant as before. To my son, it read again, but the ink was darker, steadier, as though written at a different time. Back at the barn, the three of them, Jacob, Emily, and Noah, sat around the workbench. The letter rested under the soft glow of the hanging lamp. The sheriff hadn't returned yet, and the house felt hushed, waiting. Jacob unfolded the paper with deliberate care. The ink shimmered faintly in the light. He began to read aloud, his voice low and uncertain. I never meant to let my silence grow this loud. There are things a man can't say until he's lost the chance. If you ever find these words, know that I was proud, even when I didn't show it. The room was utterly still. Emily's eyes glistened as she leaned closer. Noah whispered, "That sounds like the first one." Jacob nodded, reading on. If life has already taken me, then maybe these letters are all that's left of who I was. Maybe they'll find the right hand someday, someone who understands that love isn't loud, but it lasts. Jacob's throat tightened. He lowered the letter slowly, unable to continue. The words echoed too closely to the things he had never said to Claire, to Emily, to anyone. Emily reached out and touched his arm gently. "Dad, you okay?" He nodded, but didn't look at her. "Yeah," he said softly. "It's just strange how the world keeps sending us reminders." Noah tilted his head. "Reminders of what?" Jacob folded the letter again, setting it on the table. "That we shouldn't wait until it's too late." Outside, Echo shifted in her stall, the boards creaking softly. The wind picked up, sweeping through the valley, rattling the loose shutters of the barn. Jacob glanced toward the window. The world outside seemed alive, moving with purpose. Emily's voice was small when she spoke. "Do you think it's from the same person?" "Maybe," Jacob said. "Or maybe it's from someone trying to tell us what they couldn't say when they were alive." The air felt heavier now, filled with the quiet hum of something unseen. Noah clutched the edge of the table. "My mom always says God finds strange ways to talk to us," he whispered. Jacob smiled faintly. She might be right. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Jacob sat alone in the barn again, the two letters laid side by side. The lamplight flickered across them like firelight. The ink shimmered where it hadn't faded, forming words that seemed to pulse with life. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, and for the first time in years, he prayed. Not for help, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. When he opened his eyes, Echo was staring at him through the open stall door, her gaze steady and warm. "You knew, didn't you?" he whispered. "You knew there was another one." Echo blinked, her breath curling through the lamplight. She stepped closer and pressed her nose gently against his shoulder. Jacob's voice was rough when he spoke again. "All right, girl, I'm listening." The next morning, Sheriff Collins returned. When Jacob handed him the second letter, the sheriff whistled softly. "Another one? Seems you've stirred up a story older than both of us." Jacob didn't reply. His eyes drifted toward Emily, who stood by the window sketching Echo against the rising sun. The child he'd nearly lost to his own silence was right there, alive, looking at him with the quiet trust he once thought he'd broken forever. And for the first time since Claire's death, Jacob felt something shift inside him. A door creaking open, letting the light in. The sound of rain had faded, replaced by the gentle murmur of wind moving through the tall pines. Days had passed since Jacob found the second letter, yet its presence still lingered like the aftertaste of a memory that refused to fade. The barn smelled faintly of hay and old paper. Both letters now sat in a wooden box beside the window, their fragile edges protected by cloth. Jacob stood by the door, staring out at the horizon. The morning sun was slow to rise, its light spilling across the field where Echo grazed quietly. Emily's laughter drifted through the yard as she played fetch with Noah and an old leather ball she'd found behind the shed. The boy's arm was healing, wrapped neatly in a white sling. His face, once pale with fear, had regained color, a reminder that life could return even after being lost for a while. Jacob felt something unfamiliar as he watched them. It wasn't peace yet, not completely, but it was softer than the emptiness that had lived inside him since Claire's death. It was the beginning of something. Connection, maybe. "Dad?" Emily's voice pulled him back. She stood in the doorway, her sketchbook pressed against her chest. "Can we visit the town today? Sheriff Collins said there's a service at the church." Jacob nodded. "Yeah, might be good for all of us." The town of Cascade Ridge was small, tucked between the mountain roads and the river. The people there knew each other by name, by history, and sometimes by heartbreak. When Jacob drove into town with Emily and Noah, heads turned. It wasn't often that Jacob Harris left his farm, let alone appeared in public with company. At the general store, Sheriff Collins met them with his familiar calm. "You're just in time," he said, tipping his hat. "Got something you'll want to see." He led them toward the town hall, where a table had been set up with old photographs and documents spread across it, remnants rescued from the flood debris. "This here came from the same ridge where you found those letters," the sheriff explained. "We had the county archivist take a look." He handed Jacob a faded photograph, sealed in a clear sleeve. Jacob's breath caught. The picture showed a man standing beside a young boy in front of a weathered barn. The man's features were sharp but kind, his eyes carrying a familiar sorrow. The caption scrawled on the back read, "William Grant, Cascade Ridge, 1972. "Grant?" Jacob repeated quietly. "That's the old family that owned the logging camp up the mountain." Collins nodded. "The same. Seems these letters belonged to him. There's record he lost his son in a flood nearly 50 years ago. They never found the boy's body, only the father's notes scattered near the river." Jacob turned the photo over again, studying the man's face. Something in his eyes, the weight, the restraint, felt achingly familiar. "He looks like someone who never learned how to say what mattered," Jacob murmured. The sheriff gave a small, knowing smile. "Maybe that's why his words waited this long to find the right hands." Emily touched Jacob's arm gently. "Maybe they were meant for you, Dad." He looked at her, startled. "For me?" She nodded. "You found them. Echo led you to them. Maybe they were waiting for someone who'd understand." Jacob didn't know how to answer. The notion felt too big, too impossible, yet part of him believed it. He turned toward the window, where rain had begun to patter against the glass. "If that's true," he said softly, "then maybe I owe that man a thank you." That evening, back at the farm, the rain thickened into a steady downpour. The sound of it against the tin roof filled the silence. Emily and Noah sat near the fire, their laughter rising and falling like the warmth from the flames. Jacob watched them for a while before standing and walking to the barn. Echo was there, waiting. Her coat gleamed in the lantern light, her mane tangled but beautiful. She turned her head as he approached, eyes calm and knowing. Jacob stroked her neck. "You were the one who started all this," he said. "You made me look." Echo snorted softly, her breath warm against his hand. Jacob leaned against the stall door, letting the smell of hay and rain ground him. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think silence was easier, safer. But it's not. It just makes you forget what love sounds like." For a moment, the world felt still. Then, from the far end of the barn, came a faint creak. Emily had entered quietly, holding something in her hand, the photograph from town. "You should keep this," she said, offering it to him. Jacob took it, his fingers brushing hers. "You think so?" "Yeah," she said simply. "Because you know what it means." He nodded, setting the photo on the wall beam above Echo's stall. The image of William Grant and his son watched over them now, a silent witness to everything they had learned. Later that night, after Emily and Noah had gone to bed, Jacob returned to the barn again. The letters rested beside the lantern, the photo above them. He sat down, elbows on his knees, and whispered to the empty air, "I never told Claire enough. Never told Emily I was proud of her. I thought they knew. Maybe this is my chance to say it, even if it's late." Echo stirred softly, her tail swishing through the straw. The rain outside slowed to a drizzle. Jacob lifted his eyes toward the rafters, where the wind hummed through the cracks. "If you can hear me, Claire," he said, his voice breaking just slightly, "thank you for sending this horse to me. She reminded me how to listen again." He didn't expect an answer, but somewhere beyond the sound of the rain, he thought he heard it anyway. Faint, tender, like a breath carried on the wind. "I never stopped listening." Jacob smiled, small and weary, as Echo lowered her head beside him. The lamplight flickered once, then steadied. The past had not returned to haunt him. It had returned to heal. The church bell rang once, its sound rippling through the quiet streets of Cascade Ridge, like a memory stirring after a long sleep. The sky was overcast, heavy with unshed rain, and the mountains were veiled in mist. Jacob parked his truck in front of the small white chapel, the same place where Claire's funeral had been held 3 years earlier. He hadn't stepped foot inside since. Emily walked beside him, clutching her sketchbook against her chest, while Noah trailed behind, shy and curious. People turned as they entered. Old neighbors, townsfolk who remembered Jacob as the man who used to smile easily, before grief had settled into his bones. Sheriff Collins waved them over, his expression solemn but kind. "Glad you made it," he said. "I think this might be something worth hearing." Inside, the church was warm and dim, lit by candles flickering in the tall windows. The pews creaked as people took their seats. At the front stood a simple wooden lectern, and, beside it, a display table with 2 yellowed envelopes laid carefully under glass. Jacob's stomach tightened when he saw them. The letters he'd found in the ravine. Collins stepped to the lectern, removing his hat. "Most of you know about the discovery made after the storm. Letters from a man named William Grant, written sometime around 1970. His words were never delivered, washed away by the floods that took both his son and his home. Today, I'd like to read them aloud, because sometimes the past needs a voice to finish what it started." A hush fell over the church. Rain began to patter softly against the roof, as if the sky were listening too. Collins unfolded the first letter, his voice steady but tender as he read. "If you ever find this, know that I loved you more than my silence ever showed. I wasn't good with words, but that never meant I didn't feel them. I kept my love quiet, because I thought you already knew." Jacob's throat closed. He looked at Emily, who sat straight-backed, her small hands folded in her lap. Her eyes glistened, mirroring his own reflection of loss, not just for Claire, but for all the words he'd never said. The sheriff continued, his voice trembling slightly now. "I worked too hard. I missed too many dinners. I thought I had more time. If there's anything left of me when you read this, let it be the truth that I was proud, not because of what you did, but because of who you were." The sound of quiet sobs rippled through the pews. Faces bent low, hands wiped tears. This wasn't just one man's confession. It was every father's unspoken apology, every son's unanswered question. When the reading ended, silence lingered. Heavy, sacred. Then the sheriff stepped aside and gestured toward Jacob. "You found the letters, Jacob. Would you like to say something?" Jacob froze. Dozens of eyes turned toward him, expectant. His pulse hammered in his ears. For years he had avoided speaking, at funerals, at gatherings, even at home. But now, surrounded by the echoes of a man who'd also failed to speak in time, he rose. He walked slowly to the lectern, resting both hands on its edge. His voice came out low at first, rough like gravel. "I used to think silence kept me safe, that if I didn't say what hurt, it wouldn't break me again. But all it did was build walls so thick I couldn't hear my own daughter when she called." Emily looked up at him, her face soft with understanding. Jacob swallowed hard, continuing. "That letter, it wasn't written for me, but it might as well have been. Because I've been that man. I've worked too much. I've been afraid to love out loud, and maybe I can't change what's gone. But I can say this." He turned toward Emily. "I'm proud of you, Em. I'm proud of how strong you are, and I miss your mom every day. But today, I think she'd be proud too." Emily's tears spilled silently down her cheeks. In that moment, the years of distance between them dissolved like frost under sunlight. Jacob's voice broke on the last word, and when he stepped back, the whole room seemed to breathe again. Outside, the storm had stopped. The doors of the church stood open, letting in a thin beam of pale light that cut through the air like a promise. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Sheriff Collins approached Jacob. "You did good up there," he said quietly. "You gave that letter the ending it never had." Jacob nodded, his eyes distant. "Maybe it gave me one too." When they stepped outside, the mountains glowed faintly in the post-rain haze. Echo stood tied near the fence, her coat damp, her eyes reflecting the soft gold of the afternoon. Emily ran to her, wrapping her small arms around the horse's neck. "You see, girl?" she whispered. "You helped everyone?" Jacob watched them, his daughter, and the creature that had led him back to life. For the first time in years, he didn't feel haunted by loss. He felt accompanied by it, as if grief had shifted into something gentler, something that walked beside him instead of pulling him down. As they rode home, the sun broke through the clouds in wide, glowing beams that stretched across the valley. The land shimmered, not washed clean, but reborn. Jacob glanced at Emily and said, almost to himself, "Sometimes love takes the long way home." She smiled. "But it always finds a way, doesn't it?" He nodded. "Yeah, it does." Behind them, the church bell rang again, softer this time, a farewell, or maybe a blessing. Echo lifted her head at the sound, huffing softly into the wind, and as they disappeared into the fading light, it seemed that even the mountains leaned closer, listening to the echo of words finally spoken aloud. Morning sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, catching the steam rising from Jacob's coffee mug. The house, once silent and heavy, now carried soft sounds. Emily humming while she drew, the kettle whistling faintly, the rhythmic scrape of Echo's hooves on the dirt outside. It was the kind of quiet that felt alive, not empty. The town's church service had left a trace in everyone's heart, a feeling that lingered like warmth after a fire. People had stopped by the farm the day before, leaving pies, flowers, and thank-you notes. Some wanted to talk about the letters, others just wanted to see the man whose horse had uncovered them. Jacob found it strange, being noticed again after hiding for so long. He looked out the window. Emily sat by the fence with Noah, showing him how to shade the legs of a horse in her sketchbook. Echo stood behind them, patient and still, her tail swaying lazily. The sight stirred something deep in Jacob, a kind of fragile peace he didn't dare name. He stepped outside, the morning air cool and sweet. "You two planning to draw the whole ranch?" he teased. Emily grinned. "Only the best parts." Noah pointed at Echo. "She's the hero. She has to be in every picture." Jacob smiled, rubbing the horse's neck. "She's earned that, I guess." Emily looked up, her eyes curious. "Dad, what'll happen to the letters now?" He hesitated. "Sheriff's keeping them safe for now. Says the county wants to archive them. But do you think they still matter?" Jacob thought for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the hills. "Yeah," he said softly. "Because even if the people who wrote them are gone, their words found their way to someone who needed them. That's what matters." Emily nodded, sketching another line. "Like Mom's stories." Jacob blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" "She used to write little notes to herself. I found one in her old recipe book last year." Emily rummaged in her bag, pulling out a folded scrap of paper. "I didn't show you before because I didn't think you'd want to see it." Jacob took the note gently. The handwriting was Claire's, looping, graceful. It read, "If you ever feel lost, follow the sound that knows your name." His chest tightened. The words were so simple, but they struck him like lightning. He stared at the paper for a long moment before whispering, "Why didn't you show me this sooner?" Emily's eyes dropped. "Because you didn't talk about her. I thought maybe it would hurt." Jacob's voice was quiet. "It does. But it's the kind of hurt that means she's still with us." The wind shifted then, carrying the faintest echo of a whinny from the barn. Echo lifted her head, ears twitching. Her gaze turned toward the woods beyond the property, the same direction where everything had begun. "What is it, girl?" Jacob murmured, following her line of sight. The horse took a few slow steps forward, then stopped, as if waiting for him. Noah tilted his head. "Maybe she hears something again." Jacob listened, but there was only wind, soft, steady, blending with the rustle of pine needles. Yet beneath it all, there was a strange familiarity, a rhythm, a tone he couldn't quite name. He stepped closer to Echo. "Show me." Emily looked worried. "Dad, what if it's dangerous?" He smiled faintly. "Then it's a good thing she knows the way." They followed Echo across the field, past the fence line, through the thinning trees where the light shimmered like water. The ground was soft underfoot, still damp from the recent rain. They reached a clearing Jacob had never really noticed before, a small rise overlooking the valley. Echo stopped there, lowering her head. In the middle of the clearing, half buried beneath wildflowers and moss, stood an old wooden post with a rusted horseshoe nailed to it. The shape was barely visible beneath the weathering, but Jacob recognized it instantly. "This used to be part of the Grant property," he said quietly, "before the flood took it." Emily crouched beside the post, tracing her fingers along the cracked wood. "It's like she brought us to what's left of them." Jacob nodded. "Maybe so." For a while, none of them spoke. The wind brushed through the meadow, carrying the distant sound of the river below. Then Jacob noticed something, carved faintly into the wood, almost erased by time. WG and TG, forever home. He felt the world tilt for a moment, the weight of all the connections settling in his chest, the letters, the loss, the voice that had guided him back to life. Emily stood beside him, her voice soft. "Do you think he found his son again? Wherever they are?" Jacob's eyes glistened. "Yeah, I think they did." As they turned to leave, Echo gave one final snort, brushing her muzzle against Jacob's shoulder. He rested his hand on her neck, smiling. "You brought me here for a reason, didn't you? You're not done teaching me yet." The walk back was quiet, peaceful. The farm appeared in the distance, framed by sunlight breaking through clouds, the kind of light that came only after long storms. That evening, Jacob placed Claire's note beside the 2 old letters on his desk. 3 messages, 3 voices from different times, bound together by loss, by love, by echoes that refused to die. He whispered into the stillness, "I hear you." And in the silence that followed, he could have sworn the house sighed back, gentle, forgiving, alive again. Outside, under the first stars, Echo stood motionless in the pasture, head lifted toward the hills. A soft breeze stirred her mane, and for an instant it sounded like someone whispering her name. Morning light stretched lazily across the valley, soft and golden, warming the damp earth. It was the first time in weeks that the sky above Cascade Ridge showed no trace of storm. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and freshly cut grass. Inside the barn, Echo stood calm and bright-eyed, her once injured leg strong again. She swished her tail as Jacob brushed her coat, the strokes steady and patient, not out of habit, but out of quiet gratitude. For the first time since Claire's passing, the farm felt alive again. Not loud or busy, but alive in the gentle ways that matter, in the soft laughter of a child, in the hum of life returning where silence once lived. Emily ran barefoot through the dew-soaked grass, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, her laughter chasing after the morning breeze. Jacob leaned against the barn door, watching her. There was something healing about the sight. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but deeply human. He had forgotten that life didn't need to shout to feel full. Sometimes it was enough just to breathe, without feeling the ache behind every breath. Noah's mother arrived mid-morning, her old blue sedan kicking up dust as it rolled down the dirt road. She rushed from the car, eyes brimming with tears as she pulled her son into her arms. "Oh, my baby," she whispered, trembling. Noah smiled shyly, the sling still looped around his arm. Jacob stood back, giving them space. There was a certain holiness in reunion, he thought, not religious, but raw. Sheriff Collins, who had come along for the ride, gave Jacob a nod. "You did right by that boy," he said. Jacob shrugged. "It wasn't me. It was the horse." Collins chuckled. "Well, you were smart enough to listen. That counts." Emily tugged at Jacob's sleeve. "Can Noah come say goodbye to Echo before they leave?" "Of course," Jacob said softly. The boy walked up to the mare, his small hand brushing her neck. Echo lowered her head to meet him, her breath warm and steady. "Thank you," Noah whispered. "You saved me." Echo blinked slowly, her eyes calm and deep, as if she understood every word. Then she gave a low, gentle whinny that seemed to vibrate through the still morning air. It wasn't loud, but it carried, reaching the trees and the hills beyond. When the car finally disappeared down the road, Emily stood beside her father in the field. "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" she asked. Jacob smiled faintly. "Maybe. But some people come into your life just long enough to remind you what kindness looks like. That's enough." They spent the rest of the morning fixing the broken fence along the pasture. Emily fetched nails while Jacob worked the hammer. It was slow work, but neither of them minded. Every sound, the creak of wood, the echo of laughter, the rhythmic thud of the hammer, felt like the heartbeat of something being rebuilt. At noon, they took a break under the big oak tree near the creek. The water shimmered, running low but clear after the storm. Emily sketched while Jacob ate, watching the clouds drift lazily above. "Dad," she said suddenly, not looking up from her page, "do you think Mom would like the way things are now?" Jacob's hand stilled. The question hung between them like a breath held too long. Finally, he said, "I think she'd love it. She always believed in peace after storms." Emily smiled, closing her sketchbook. "I think Echo helped with that." Jacob chuckled. "Yeah, she did more for us than we'll ever understand." The afternoon passed quietly. A breeze carried the scent of hay and wild flowers through the open barn. Jacob worked on repairing the saddle straps while Emily swept the floor, humming softly. The rhythm of the day felt new but familiar, as if life had circled back to its proper shape. Later, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting, everything in shades of gold and amber. Jacob led Echo out to the pasture. The light caught the mare's mane, making it glow like spun silver. Emily walked beside them, her hand brushing Echo's flank. They stopped at the fence line, looking out across the valley. The town was distant but visible, a scatter of rooftops, and the faint toll of the church bell marking the hour. Everything was calm, the kind of calm that comes only after understanding, after acceptance. Jacob took a deep breath. "You know," he said, "I used to think peace meant nothing ever changed. But maybe peace is when you finally stop fighting what already has." Emily nodded slowly. "Like letting go?" "Exactly." They stood there for a long time, watching the sky turn from gold to violet. Echo grazed quietly nearby, her head bowed, the picture of serenity. The wind played with Emily's hair, and Jacob reached over to tuck a loose strand behind her ear, a small, instinctive gesture, but one that felt monumental. When they finally walked back to the barn, Jacob noticed something he hadn't before: Claire's old wind chime hanging by the door. It had been silent for years, tangled and rusted, but now, as the breeze picked up, it began to move. The sound was faint at first, then clear, a soft, melodic ringing that filled the air like a voice long forgotten, but never gone. Jacob froze, listening. The chime swayed gently, catching the last light of day. Emily looked up at him, eyes wide. "Dad, that's Mom's chime." He nodded, smiling through the tears that suddenly blurred his vision. "Yeah," he whispered. "She finally found her wind." The sound lingered, blending with the evening air. The farm glowed under the setting sun. Nothing miraculous, just honest and whole. For the first time, Jacob felt no need to look back, no ache to rewrite the past. The world had finally stopped demanding something from him. It simply was. That night, as darkness settled, the farm rested in perfect silence. The stars hung bright over the valley, their reflections shimmering faintly in the stream below. Echo lay down in the pasture, her breathing slow and steady. And in the house, Jacob and Emily slept, the sound of the wind chime drifting through the open window like a promise kept. The last traces of summer were slipping away, leaving the Cascade foothills brushed with early autumn gold. The air was cooler now, filled with the scent of apples ripening and pine needles drying under the sun. The farm had settled into its new rhythm, a quiet, living heartbeat. Each morning, Jacob rose before dawn to tend the horses, and each evening he sat on the porch with Emily, listening to the wind weave through the valley. On one such morning, as the mist still clung to the hills, Jacob found Echo standing by the far fence, staring toward the ridge again. He smiled to himself. "You never get tired of that view, do you?" he said softly. But there was something different in the way she stood, still, alert, ears twitching. He followed her gaze. The horizon shimmered faintly, the kind of light that doesn't quite belong to sunrise. A pale haze hovered over the ridge like a memory. Jacob's chest tightened, but he didn't know why. When Emily joined him a few minutes later, she noticed it too. "Dad, look." Across the valley, faint but unmistakable, came the echo of a horse's whinny. Not loud, not near, but clear enough to feel rather than hear. Echo lifted her head, responding with a soft, trembling call of her own. The sound drifted over the land, then faded, leaving the air strangely charged. "Was that another horse?" Emily asked. Jacob frowned. "Could be. Might have wandered off from one of the neighboring ranches." But his voice betrayed uncertainty. The following days passed quietly, yet the sound returned every evening at dusk. Faint, distant, almost sorrowful. Echo would always answer, her tone low and steady, as if speaking to something unseen. Jacob couldn't explain it, and for reasons he couldn't name, he didn't want to. By the third evening, the air had turned sharp and cold. The sky was streaked with silver clouds, and a restless wind swept through the valley. Jacob sat on the porch, sharpening a fence post, when Emily appeared in the doorway. "It's happening again," she whispered. He looked up. Echo stood in the field, her body tense, staring toward the ridge as that haunting call floated across the valley once more. Jacob set the knife down and rose. "Stay here, Em." "No," she said quickly. "Not this time." They walked together toward the pasture, the light fading into dusk. The world seemed to hold its breath. When they reached Echo, she turned her head slightly, her eyes reflecting the last gleam of day. Jacob rested a hand on her neck. "You hear it too, don't you?" The horse exhaled softly, then took a step toward the far end of the field, the same direction she had led him that first night after the storm. Jacob hesitated, but Emily tugged his sleeve. Dad, maybe it's leading us somewhere again. He stared at her, the words striking something deep within him. Maybe, he murmured. Or maybe it's just reminding us. They followed as Echo walked slowly toward the ridge path. The sun had slipped behind the mountains, and the first stars began to pierce the purple sky. The air smelled faintly of rain, even though no storm was coming. When they reached the clearing above the ravine, the place where everything had begun, Echo stopped. She pawed the ground once, then stood still, her ears pricked. The valley below was dark and silent, save for the whisper of the wind. Jacob looked around, puzzled. "What are we supposed to see, girl?" Then, as the last light of evening faded, something caught his eye. A flicker of movement near the base of an old pine. He stepped closer and froze. There, carved, faintly into the bark, were letters. The same initials he'd seen before, WG and TG. But below them, barely visible under the moss, was a newer carving, CH and JH. Jacob's breath caught. He brushed the moss away, tracing the lines with his fingers. It was their initials, Claire Harris and Jacob Harris, carved long ago when they'd first bought this land. He'd forgotten about it, forgotten that she'd brought him here one evening years back to carve it while laughing about how forever should have a place on Earth. Emily stood beside him, her voice trembling. "You and Mom, you did this?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah. She said the wind would remember us even when we forgot ourselves." He turned toward Echo, who stood still as stone, her mane rippling slightly in the wind. "You brought me back here for this," he whispered. "To remember." The echo came again then, faint, distant, carried by the valley air. But this time, Jacob understood. It wasn't another horse calling. It was the land returning his own voice, the sound of all he had lost and found again. Emily slipped her hand into his. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Jacob swallowed hard. "Yeah, it is." They stood there until the stars brightened fully, the world bathed in pale light. The past no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a bridge, something that connected rather than confined. When they finally walked home, Echo followed quietly behind, her head bowed, her steps unhurried. Jacob glanced over his shoulder one last time at the ridge. The wind moved through the pines, and for a heartbeat, he thought he heard Claire's laughter. Light and fleeting, carried through Echo's final soft whinny. That night, sleep came easily for the first time in years. The farm lay under a blanket of starlight, and somewhere beyond the hills, the wind whispered through the trees, repeating that ancient promise carved in wood and memory. Forever home. The first frost arrived quietly. It painted the edges of the pastures with silver, clinging to fence rails and spider webs, turning every blade of grass into crystal. The air in the Cascade foothills had changed, colder, sharper, filled with the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter. Jacob stood on the porch, wrapped in his old wool coat, a mug of coffee steaming between his hands. The morning light filtered through the pines, soft and gold. It was the kind of light that made everything seem both fragile and infinite. Echo grazed in the lower field, her white coat glowing faintly in the sun. The bandage on her leg was long gone, the scar nearly invisible now, a faint reminder of pain that had healed. Emily ran across the field toward her, scarf fluttering, her laughter echoing through the valley. Jacob watched her, a small, quiet smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Inside the house, the wind chime, Claire's chime, sang softly in the breeze. The sound drifted out through the open window, carrying across the farm. It was no longer the sound of mourning. It was the sound of peace. Jacob set down his coffee and walked toward the barn. He moved slower these days, not from age but from a new sense of calm. For years he had walked quickly, as though he could outrun grief. Now he moved like a man who knew he didn't have to. Inside the barn, sunlight poured through the gaps in the wood, falling in thin stripes across the floor. Dust swirled in the beams of light like drifting memories. He reached for the old photo tacked to the post above Echo's stall, the picture of William Grant and his son. Next to it hung Claire's note and the 2 letters found in the ravine, preserved in clear frames. Together, they looked like a timeline of voices that had once been lost and now found their way home. Emily entered quietly behind him, her boots crunching against the straw. "You're looking at them again," she said softly. He nodded. "Just thinking how strange it is. How things connect across time. How one act of kindness can travel decades to reach someone it was never meant for." Emily leaned against the post beside him. "Maybe it was meant for you all along." Jacob smiled faintly. "Maybe so." He turned toward her, brushing a speck of hay from her sleeve. "You've grown a lot, you know that," she laughed. "You say that every week." "I mean it," he said gently. "You've got her in you. The way you see the world. The way you care." Emily lowered her eyes. "Do you still miss her?" "Every day," Jacob said simply. "But missing her doesn't hurt like it used to. It reminds me that I was lucky enough to love her." Outside, Echo lifted her head, ears twitching toward the hills. A thin layer of fog was beginning to settle across the valley, catching the sunlight and turning the air golden. Emily squinted at the horizon. "It looks like everything's glowing." Jacob followed her gaze. "It's the light before winter. Happens every year, but it never looks the same twice." They stood there for a while, watching the mist roll over the grass. The world felt hushed, as though holding its breath. Then Echo started moving, slow, deliberate steps toward the ridge path. Jacob felt that familiar pull in his chest. Emily looked up at him. "Do we follow her?" He smiled. "When has she ever been wrong?" They walked beside Echo through the thinning fog. The sun sank lower, turning the fields into rivers of amber light. Every sound seemed magnified. The crunch of frost underfoot, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the soft rhythm of Echo's hooves. When they reached the top of the ridge, the view opened before them. Endless hills rolling into the horizon, the town glimmering faintly in the distance. Jacob stopped, breathing in deeply. "This is where it started," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "And where it ends." But Jacob shook his head. "No, Em, not ends, just changes." They stood there, watching as the sun dipped lower, painting the valley in shades of gold and rose. The light caught Echo's mane, making her look almost ethereal, not just an animal, but something more. She turned her head toward Jacob, and for a brief moment he thought he saw a reflection in her eyes, Claire's gentle smile, faint and flickering like sunlight on water. He blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling remained. Warm, certain, complete. Emily slipped her hand into his. Do you think she's watching us? Jacob squeezed her fingers. I think she's been with us the whole time. The last of the sun disappeared behind the mountains. A soft wind rolled through the grass, carrying with it the faint sound of the church bell from town, one slow, lingering toll. Echo lifted her head, gave a low, steady whinny, and the sound rose through the valley like an echo answering the bell. Jacob felt something shift inside him. Not loss, not sorrow, but the quiet fullness of gratitude. The weight he'd carried for years had turned into something lighter, something that breathed. He turned to Emily. Let's go home. They walked down the ridge, the sky deepening from gold to violet. The first stars began to appear, glimmering above the darkening hills. Behind them, Echo followed at a slow pace, her hooves muffled against the earth, her head lowered in calm. When they reached the farm, the porch light flickered on automatically, casting a warm glow against the house. Jacob paused, looking back one last time at the valley. The world was still, quiet, at peace. Inside, the fireplace crackled softly. Emily curled up on the couch, sketchbook open on her knees. Jacob poured himself a cup of tea and sat beside her. She was drawing again, the three of them on the ridge, the sunset stretching wide behind them. Echo stood in the center, her mane flowing, her eyes gentle. Jacob watched in silence until she finished. That's beautiful, he said. Emily smiled. It's us. He nodded, a tear catching the light in his eye. Yeah, it is. Outside, the night settled over the valley like a blanket. The wind chime stirred once, twice, and then fell silent, not because the wind had stopped, but because there was nothing left to say. And as Jacob turned off the lamp, the last light faded from the room, not into darkness, but into peace. Sometimes all it takes is one voice, even from a horse, to remind us what love really means. If this story touched your heart, type 1 in the comments to let me know you felt it too. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might be the one that stays with you forever.